Well, thank you, Darren, for that introduction, and the ACCJ for having us here today. As Darren mentioned, my previous career is in politics, and given this U.S. presidential election, I'm happily retired from politics. I couldn't make sense of it any more than the rest of you, but I believe that we're going to have some question and answer and discussion, and I'm happy to talk about our election and what may happen next Tuesday, and what it may mean here in Japan and around the world, because whether we like it or not, it's an incredibly important event. So happy to put my old hat back on. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Uber, and thank you for those kind remarks, Darren. I think here in Tokyo, there's a fairly limited Uber experience. And I'll say Uber, but obviously there's other ride-sharing companies, so in ride-sharing generally. So here in Tokyo, you can do just a couple of things. You can order Uber Black, which is our more high-end service, a new Toyota Avalon or Mercedes S-Series, a little bit more expensive. We partner with local companies that have limos and drivers. Or you can now, thankfully, order food on your app through Uber Eats, which we already have over 1,000 drivers delivering food from local restaurants throughout Tokyo. We have that in major cities around the world. What you don't have in Tokyo is what most of the rest of the major global cities and even smaller cities have, which is ride sharing. And so I think many of you here would probably like the convenience of an affordable, efficient, inexpensive ride wherever you are, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, suburban area, whether it's raining or not. And so there's no doubt there's great consumer interest in what we do. And we're eager to bring it here to Tokyo, and would love your help on that. But I want to talk a little bit about sort of a bigger issue, which is where is all this leading? And Uber's only 6.5 years old, so there's no way 6.5 years ago, or even 4 years ago, anybody from Uber thought they'd stand up here in Tokyo and talking about how we fit in to the future of urban mobility. But major things are happening in terms of the world, in terms of how people are changing the way they move around cities. And ride sharing becomes an important part of that. So I'll start by talking about where we are today. So obviously, we have over 2 billion cars in the world. In places like China and India, the car ownership rates are growing exponentially. The problem is not these cars themselves, so many of them made by great automakers here in Japan, but it's how we use them. We almost all use them individually. So the average car in the world is only used 4% of the time. That's our most least efficient resource any of us own. And if you're a lower income family, or the term we use in the United States, a middle class working family, it's one of your most expensive parts of your life after housing. So we have all these cars on the road, and as you know, when you drive your car in most cities around the world, more often than not, you look to your left and someone's sitting in a car by themselves. You're in the car by yourselves, and the person to the right's by yourself, particularly at commuting time. And obviously, this is how many of our cities look. So you all know, as business leaders, the productivity costs that congestion cause. What it causes to individuals: they have less time for family, they have less time to eat healthy, they have less time to exercise. But there's also massive pollution and emissions effects from this. So 22% of all the carbon emissions. Now, in the United States, we're still having a debate about climate change. I think in most parts of the world, there's agreement that our climate is changing, and it's warming, and it's dangerous. Over 20% of the reason is the emissions from automobiles. So we obviously need to do all we can to get that down. Parking. This is a US statistic, but it's 8 times as many parking spaces as cars. 15% of the world's space in cities is parking. And just like the cars, often they're empty. So in cities around the world that are starting to embrace ride sharing and understanding that people are changing the way they're getting around, for the first time you're seeing governments change the law and reducing the number of parking spots required for new residential or commercial construction. In some places, they're going to 0 parking spaces, which obviously saves the developers a lot of money, speeds up that process. But also, we need to reclaim that space. So in many places around the world, including Tokyo, where I live in San Francisco, it's an epidemic in terms of housing problems. Well, if we can reclaim some of this parking space and build on it create more parkland, build more schools. It's going to be an enormous addition. There's a big debate around ride sharing about how do we compete with or complement public transportation. Well, in New York City, wonderful subway system. In London, wonderful tube. Here in Japan, wonderful metro system. But even in the best cities of the world, those public transportation lines don't reach everyone. In fact, in many places, it can take 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour to get to that last subway or metro line. And of course, so many of our jobs around the world, so here in the US, 30% of our jobs require a 90-minute commute by public transit. Think about that. So many of our restaurants and retail establishments to this day in cities are basing their decisions about where to site their establishment based on its proximity to public transportation. And if you look at this statistic, Harvard University came out with a recent study. It was a global study, longitudinal, going 25 or 30 years. And it was a surprising finding. They determined, and this is less of an issue in Japan, but it's a big issue in most parts of the world. What's the number one reason people stay trapped in poverty? It's not education or test scores. It's not crime rates. It's the cost and inaccessibility of transportation. It takes people too long and it costs them too much money to get to school, to get to work. And again, for most of us in this room, we can get where we need to get the way we need to get there. But for a lot of people around the world, they have to think really hard about it. They don't have much income flexibility and they don't have much time flexibility. So this is just for those of you that haven't used Uber, that's the app. So you basically, it finds you now through GPS, but anywhere you are in a city where we operate fully, and that's not here in Tokyo, you can get a ride in 2 or 3 minutes. And that's not just a matter of convenience. We want people to change the way they move around cities. So here in Tokyo, the debate is largely around Uber and ride sharing about how it competes with the taxi industry or not. And there's no doubt there's some competition in markets. We're in over 450 cities in just about 80 countries. But very few of the people who use Uber are using it instead of taking a taxi. They're using it instead of driving their own car. So when we talk about growing our business, as all of you do every day, we don't talk about the taxi market. We talk about the personal car use market and ownership market. And how can we get people to use their cars? Most of them will still use their car plenty of times, but a few times a month, how can they substitute the use of ride sharing and leave their car at home? So this is important. So this is Southern California, which is a great example. Unlike Tokyo, not an intensive public transportation system, not many taxis for those of you who've been in Los Angeles. Basically, if you travel there, you rent a car. If you live there, you drive your car. But this is the progression of Uber. So in LA, the darker colors are 5 minutes or under. And so our view is we need Uber to be as quick as you picking your car keys up out of your counter, going out to your driveway or garage and turning on your car. Because only then will you say, I can be confident that I can use my car less, or maybe if I'm a family, go from 2 cars to 1. So this is incredibly important. The only way this happens, by the way, is a regulatory system that allows enough drivers on the road so that anybody who passes a criminal background check, passes a clean driving record check, has the right insurance. We obviously come in on insurance on top of that. So in most parts of the world, we are regulated. There's a myth around Uber and ride sharing that we want to be deregulated. We want to be fully regulated, and in most parts of the world we are. That anybody, a nurse, a retiree, a stay-at-home parent, a student, can get in their Toyota Prius and drive people around and make a little bit of money. And then not only is it good for that individual, when you get enough drivers on the road, you can guarantee somebody, no matter where they are. And there is an inequality of transportation, meaning lower income areas just through the happenstance of urban planning that were left behind, they're transportation deserts. It's harder to get around. And that's really where our growth comes in. This is an example of Mumbai in India. And this graphic just talks about how in the beginning we just served a certain geographic area, but the wait time over time in just 2 years period, from most parts of Mumbai, which is a very difficult place to get around, as you know. In most of the areas, it's under 5 minutes. Incredibly important in terms of the flywheel of this. So this is New York City, and you see over time here, we begin in Manhattan. That's that little area on the left where the Empire State Building is and the business community. Many of you have been there. And there's plenty of taxis. It's easy to get a taxi in New York in most cases. The rest of that are what we call the outer boroughs of New York. Bronx, Brooklyn, where Hillary Clinton's campaign is headquartered, Queens. This is where Uber and ride sharing comes in. This is where our growth is. Our growth is not centered where there's a lot of taxis. Our growth is centered in places where it's been very difficult to get around. Now in America, there's also a racial component to that, where people of darker skin color, African American or Latinos, get passed by. But now this is something of neutrality, where you're able to basically, no matter who you are, what you look like, where you live, you press a button and get the same ride as someone who lives in a wealthy area. This is an important graphic about London, but we could do this all over the world. And we want to do this in Tokyo as soon as we can. This basically, the green dot shows train stations, and the blue dots are representation of all the trips going to and from tube stations. So every public transportation agency in the world, I don't know why it's called last mile instead of last kilometer, but it's called the last mile problem. How do we make it easier for people to get to and from stations? Well, in London, over 30% of our trips start or end right around a tube station. Same thing in Paris, same thing in New York, same thing in LA, same thing in Manila. People are using us to get to and from public transportation. So the way to think about that is you're on a train or a subway. Before you get to your stop, you press a button. You get off the train and the car's right there to take you home. There's no question, will there be taxis or not? Do I have to drive my car or not? It's a seamless way to extend public transportation, particularly into the suburbs. And this is a fascinating look at times of day. So you see with, there's been a big debate in London around night tube service. And you see a huge increase in areas that are not served by night tube service, where people basically didn't have any option. So we become, in some cases, a safety net for people. It may not be the primary way they get around their city, but they know at 3 a.m., whether it's a bar closing or they're taking a subway home from work if they're working the night shift, they know there'll be a way to get home. 24/7, 365, no matter where you live. This is a really important use case here in Tokyo and all around the world. Sorry, let me go back here. That's not animating, but well, what this would show is right between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. is Uber requests go through the roof, okay? Why is that important? Well, we know in our research in markets where ride sharing has become high volume, somebody under the age of 30 in London, Paris, Chicago, Illinois, Sao Paulo, Rio, Mexico City, Sydney, Australia, they would never even think, the thought doesn't occur to them that they would drive home after having anything to drink. Or they have to arrange a ride with a friend, something my generation did all the time. Huge behavior change, because you know you press a button. So here in Tokyo, we can't come anywhere near. And you say, well, in Tokyo, it's a big city, of course, but people are going to and from suburbs. We can't come anywhere close to meeting the demand. So we know our system's working well when we're able to meet the demand at restaurant and bar closing time. This is Singapore, an interesting situation. I think somewhat like Tokyo, very clean, efficient taxis, very good public transportation system. But again, you see so many of our trips centered around train stations in Singapore. And we have 30%, similar to London, similar to Paris, someone in New York. And there's no doubt the better the infrastructure of the city, and this is counterintuitive. People assume that we work best where there's poor infrastructure. We work best where we complement a well-supplied taxi system, a very efficiently run public transportation system. Because when all those things work together, healthy bike sharing programs, people can make the decision to leave their car at home. And 50% of Uber trips globally are one way. People aren't using us for everything. They might use Uber one way, taxi the way home, might use public transportation one way, Uber on the way home. So we're just filling in a gap. This isn't a choice between Uber and other forms of transportation. It's basically a complement. This is, I think, a relevant example given what you have coming to Tokyo in 2020 in terms of the Olympics. So this just shows the huge increase in Rio during the Olympics. And Rio was a relatively new market for us. We had people using us from over 100 countries. I mean, we've had, millions of people try and use Uber and UberX here in Tokyo who come to your airports. I was in Vancouver, Canada recently, a very small city compared to Tokyo, and 250,000 people have tried to use Uber at the cruise ship terminal there. So this is also important. Increasingly, tourists or business travelers expect wherever they go that ride sharing is part of how they get from the airport to the hotel and how they get around. Incredibly important. You talk to the hotel industry, you talk to the airline industry. In places where ride sharing has not flourished, there's concern because it really disrupts people's behavior around traveling. So this is what we have in Tokyo. It's called Uber Black. And, we have had people from 99 countries use it. Many of you have probably used it, and we thank you for that. ETA 6 minutes. But again, it's expensive compared to the traditional Uber product. Generally, in cities where we have the full complement of ride-sharing products, people use this maybe for an important business meeting, an anniversary, a special occasion. They use what we call UberX or Uber Pop, which is the lower-cost service for most of the way they get around. Now, here in Tokyo, we are excited about Uber Eats. And we have over 150 restaurants already, over 1,000 drivers, 15% of them are women, who are moving around food from local restaurants. Press a button, the app will tell you the food will be there in 18 minutes, 22 minutes, 25 minutes. In most parts of the world, Uber Eats stands alongside ride sharing. So the drivers who move passengers around, this is another way for them to make money. Here in Tokyo, sadly, as excited as we are about this product, this is the driver's sole purpose is to move food. We're excited about that. But where it works best is we've got this transportation logistical network. And the drivers can move people, they can move food, they can move goods. And it's another way for them to make money. And obviously your Prime Minister talked about some of his economic goals and about productivity goals. And this last line I think is important. We will increase the use of privately owned cars as a means of transport for tourists. The tourism estimates here in Tokyo, I believe, are it's going to double in another 4 or 5 years. So the only way to handle that, I think, is to get more cars on the road, delivering more tourists where they need to go. But this is incredibly important. Because that's what we're seeing in most parts around the world is finally people have said, okay, somebody who might be a small business owner or a student or a retiree, they've got a Toyota Prius, they want to drive 2 or 3 hours a week. So in many parts of the world, we have drivers just driving a few hours a week, that's it. They're doing it to supplement income. So in the United States, in China, in Australia, in Canada, places where, the economic numbers have improved, but wage stagnation has not, people are using us on top of what we would consider traditional work to give their family a little bit more economic security. So there's a mobility and an economic interesting set of data we're seeing. So this is obviously something familiar to no one I work with at Uber because they're all so young. But to all of you, this was 1973, and the world faced its first oil shortage. And in the US, in Asia, all throughout Europe, lines and lines and lines. And so what was the public policy debate? The public policy debate was, well, we can't ever let that happen to us again. So we need to make car use more efficient. We need to have fewer cars on the road, but those cars on the road should have more people in them. Carpooling. Well, carpooling has never worked on scale. There are some interesting casual carpools in some cities. I used to live in Washington, D.C. We have one there. But it's minuscule. It's never worked. But technology is changing that. So some of our bright engineers looked at this one day. That is 2 separate Uber trips. What if we could combine them? We know where the person's getting picked up. We know where they're going. Would people be willing to share a ride? So we started this in San Francisco a little more than 2.5 years ago with no idea if it would work. My generation, a little more hesitant in the beginning. Younger folks have flocked to this. So what does this mean? So UberX is our low-cost service, 1 person in the back of the Prius. This is half that, okay? Half that. And you're basically, when the technology works well, you're only inconvenienced by 3 or 4 minutes. So this is a choice. You can decide whether to share a ride or not. You opt in. 20% of Uber's business globally now is carpooling. San Francisco, Los Angeles, 50. Los Angeles, 40. Huge in Toronto, huge in Mexico City. This is incredible, so think about that. Uber to many people in those cities in 2 years won't be getting in the backseat by yourself. What Uber is to them and ride sharing is to them is carpooling. So why do people do it? Well, it's less expensive. People like the social aspect of it, particularly younger generation. But many people say they believe they're doing a good thing for their environment, and they are. Because 30 individual car trips in 30 cars becomes 30 people in 1 car. And you begin to see a massive potential reduction in congestion. So on the left is if people took separate trips. So that's a heat map. Those yellow, purple, red areas are where there's a lot of traffic. When you turn them into Uber pool trips, you smooth it out. And you begin to have less. So again, when you think about Tokyo, we don't have traditional ride sharing here yet. Most of the major cities around the world now have carpooling as an important core of how people are getting around. And you think about so many people use Uber pool to and from public transportation, back to my previous point, but it's so inexpensive. It's always cheaper than driving your car and parking it. So in most cities, if you use Uber pool for everything you did in your entire life, business, social, travel, it is cheaper than the price of car ownership. So you're beginning to see people make that adjustment. 10% of millennials in the US now have given up a car because they prefer not to drive. And I think we all have to understand that the environmental impact. So 312 million miles. This is just San Francisco, which is a tiny city compared to cities like Tokyo. That's how many miles have been saved just in the last few months. 6.2 million gallons of fuel have been saved through people sharing rides, and that much metric tons of carbon dioxide. And so I'll talk about the autonomous future in a minute, but between now and the autonomous future, the only thing any of our cities can do to reduce congestion and emissions is carpooling. And really until the last 2 or 3 years, we all knew that, but we didn't think it was possible. Now it's possible because we're seeing consumer adoption and we're seeing the technology work so that it works well for people. If it's only going to take you an extra 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, and sometimes less, and the algorithms and the technology are getting better and better, and eventually we'll do higher capacity vehicles where 5, 6, 7, 8 people can share a ride. Some magic really begins to happen, and we know this. Those of you that have children who are, teenagers or even in their 20s, there's a massive change out there around young people and driving. So in the United States, we had the biggest decrease last year in 16-year-olds not getting licensed in the history of our country. So that's not young people saying they don't want to buy a car. They don't want to learn how to drive. Okay, my generation, our social life was built around the automobile. Their social life is built around this. And when they have to drive, it's an inconvenience to them. And by the way, it's a safety hazard for all of us. So our cities and our governments need to understand that there's a big, it's not just our desire about what good public policy would look like in terms of the future of mobility. There's a huge change in terms of how young people intend to live their lives. And they prefer, if given the option, to get around. Again, ride sharing is just part of it. They may use public transportation for most things. They may walk. They may use bike sharing. but it's an important ingredient. So as I said, 10% of millennial riders have given up their car. So ride sharing is 4% of all miles driven globally, which is pretty amazing because 6.5 years ago it didn't exist. But the estimates are by 2030 it will be 25% of all miles driven. So the goal is to have as many of those miles have multiple people in the car. Carpooling. Good for our cities, good for the environment, good for the economy. So that is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Relatively small city, hilly city, tough climate, where today, when you request an UberX, you may get in a vehicle that is autonomous. So this is happening. We acquired a company recently called Otto, which is in trucking. And just last week, we did a 180-kilometer trial in Denver, Colorado in the US, where the entire ride was driven by automation, and the driver wasn't even sitting in front while it was happening. They were in the back of the cab. This is now. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but there are human beings being moved around. And what's important is you can't flip a switch to make that happen. Toyota, an investor in Uber, we're so thrilled to have their support. Obviously, is going to be an important part of the automated future. It's not just the technology. We are a technology and software company at our heart. We're working every day on making the progress. Why is autonomous important? 1.3 million people die every year in car crashes. That's more people than die from breast cancer. Twice as many people who died in many of our major wars. That can be close to zero. Be the biggest public health benefit since the effort to reduce smoking. The transportation would happen for cents, pennies a mile. All of it will be emissions free. And the estimates are 90% of all traffic goes away because the cars will intelligently communicate with each other. Our cities will be reclaimed. None of us will lose hours and days to congestion ever again. But this isn't going to happen because you decide in 2025 as a city that you're ready for it or the technology's ready. What's happening right now with ride sharing is the bridge to this. You have to get people used to not owning their own car. You have to get used to people sharing rides because autonomy in the beginning is going to be very expensive. It's only going to work well when you've got 3 or 4 people in the route, and the tech will even be better. You just can't flip a switch. So for Tokyo to be one of the last global cities to make the move to full ride sharing and full carpooling is just going to leave Tokyo years and years behind. So what we're doing right now is the bridge to that autonomous future. And the technology is getting better and better. Obviously, there'll be regulatory discussions about this, but this day is coming. Now, our view is it will be gradual. We're still next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because of the demand, going to need human beings behind the wheel driving. But eventually, you'll have autonomy integrated into that fleet. And this is the future. But we don't have to wait for it. I think sometimes there's a debate that says, okay, we'll do the autonomous thing, 20 years from now. But to wait 20 years to reduce congestion, to give people more transportation options, to provide more safety options, that is the wrong choice. And most cities around the world now are making a decision to embrace ride sharing because they understand it's not a debate about the taxi market. It's about a much bigger thing. So, and this is the statistic. That's what it would look like. 200 people in 177 cars. Without cars, you have no traffic, no congestion, no accidents, affordability, no pollution. It's an amazing future. But again, it's not just about the technology being ready, both on the hardware side and the software side. You're going to have behavioral change in cities for this really to happen. And I think that in many cities around the world, you're seeing that change. And you're starting finally to see cities say, what if we could make our public policy choices thinking less about enabling personal car use and more about embracing a suite of options, what would that do for our cities? And we're starting to see all over the world restaurants and retail establishments not worry about where they locate their restaurant as much because they're not as reliant on being near public transportation, because 40% of our trips globally start or end at a small business. Think about that. About 30% to and from public transportation, 40% small business. Everyone's going somewhere. Some of those people are going to work and home. Pretty much everywhere else is going to a small business to spend money, and it's easier for people to be found now. And so we're excited about this future, but I think our message is if you share that Uber would be a good thing and ride sharing, because again, it's not just about Uber, we'd love your help to talk to folks around the government, not just about that you would like it, that it's a nice consumer option, and it is, and you want choice, and that's great. But it's about a bigger thing. And as we spend more time thinking about how this fits into the ride sharing, into the transportation discussion and the economic discussion, the last thing I'll say is, I worked in government for a long time, and one of the things most governments struggle with here and in the US certainly is how do we get more income to more people? The stock market in most places has bounced back relatively well. Those at the top from the income spectrum are doing very, very well. But working people haven't seen the gains. So the other thing about platforms like this is to enable a retiree or a working family just in their own time. See, we have no schedule. You work whenever you want. And when you turn on that phone in most parts of the world, if you get in a car on an Uber trip, that driver has the Uber app on, one of our ride-sharing competitors on, 2 or 3 food delivery services on. So whoever's got work for them at the moment. And our goal is we don't want our drivers to ever not have someone in the back seat or something in the trunk. So if we can, and in some cities we're getting close to that, where the driver turns on the app, there's no waiting around. They are in constant motion. And so if you're someone who's a nurse, or you're a teacher, or you're a small business owner, you're a retiree, and you've got a secure income, but you're looking for a little bit more, the ability to do it on your own terms, you decide when to work or whether to work, is such a powerful thing. And I believe that in the near term, it's going to be the biggest answer on scale, not just what we do, but platforms like this to give people maximum control. So they can drive or work 4 hours one week, not at all the next week, 12 hours the next week, take 3 weeks off. That's how people use our platform. People don't have a schedule. They use us either because they need the money. Many people use us to go on vacation instead of putting it on their credit cards. So there's also an economic rationale to this. And the truth is, there'll be some competition for the taxi industry, but the taxi industry all over the world is still doing okay. The drivers now have more option. They can drive for their taxi company and us on their side. But we are now a big source of work in major cities. Now, it's untraditional. It's not someone who's decided to make a career of it. It's not somebody who's doing it for 40 hours a week. It's someone who may be doing it for 3 or 4 hours. And so here in Japan and most places around the world, we're working every day to how do we get more money in the hands of people. And I think we'd all like wages to grow 7 or 8% for the next 5 years. That's not going to happen. So if we're living in the real world, how do we get more income to more people? Platforms like this on scale are an answer. And in our case, it's something anybody can do. Pretty much anybody can drive a car and use a smartphone if they pass the proper checks. So with that, I will stop prattling on and would love to take any thoughts you guys have about ride sharing or mobility or the American political situation. So thank you. I think we'll do this, a town hall style? Yes. Hi.
That was really interesting to start with. I just have a question about safety, and maybe it's because I'm a young woman. I like to consider myself one. So obviously the drivers would have these checks that you're talking about to make sure you're getting in the car with someone who doesn't have a criminal record, et cetera, et cetera. If you're carpooling, what about the other passengers in the car? So would you ever consider having a ride where it's, say, a woman-only ride, or somewhere where women can feel safe about who they're getting in the car with, so that they know that I don't know, given the timings when you said that they're the most popular,
Right.
so midnight until 4 a.m., you don't want to be getting in the car, potentially as a young woman, with a group of drunk young men.
Right.
I mean, which could possibly happen. So is that something that's on Uber's radar? Is that something that you'd consider, or is it not really an issue of concern?
So that's a great question. Let me talk about safety generally. So obviously everyone's going to make their own determination, but our research shows the number one reason that women around the world use us is safety. Why? Yes, we do provide criminal and driving record checks. But that's the old way of thinking about safety. The new way is technology. So what's happening on our platform is there's no anonymity. We always know who's in the car, whether it's one rider and a driver or multiple riders. We know who's in that Uber pool trip, number one. It's GPS tracked the entire time. Many places around the world, what's available everywhere, but people share their ETA, particularly at late. What does that mean? You press a button and you send your ride to your friends and family members if you're feeling unsafe or it's late at night or you're in an area you're not familiar with. We have a lot of technology now that we're bringing to the fore, including telematics, to see if drivers are driving in a reckless behavior, they're speeding. Obviously, we have a rating system, so if you were in an Uber pool trip and your fellow passenger was rude, you let us know and we take action on that. By the way, there's more incidents in trips with abusive riders than drivers. Think about that. Now, if you're a taxi driver and somebody gets in your cab and is abusive, there's nothing that can happen. In our case, we know and we investigate, and sometimes passengers are banned from our platform. So we're not, background checking other riders, but the other thing is on an Uber trip, you've got the driver, you've got another passenger. So we've done tens of millions of Uber pool trips, and so far that sort of circle of trust in the technology suite has really, I think, provided great service, and it really hasn't been an issue. But again, I think that the key thing is no anonymity. There's no question about who's in the car. So when we have had incidents, and as many rides as we do, there'll be some, we have a great relationship with law enforcement around the world. Why? We know exactly what happened. There's no manhunt around a city for someone based on the description of the shirt they were wearing or the radio station they were listening to. We know what's happening. And we continue to invest in significant R&D, including things like facial recognition technology and things. So we're excited about that. But again, I think that one of the reasons we've grown so much is safety. Yes, reduction of drunk driving. Yes, parents would rather have their kids in the back of the seat texting than in the front driving. But also particularly for women. And it's not just in places that traditionally have had unsafe transportation. There's some countries around the world where that's epidemic. It's where all over the world. So it's one of the main reasons. But again, it's that core promise of you're surrounded by a suite of technology. And the rating system is not a cute, nice-to-have thing. It's actionable. So if we see, whether it's on the rider or driver side, behavior that's either objectionable or problematic, we act on it right away. Incredibly, incredibly important. And we're trying to bring more technology to that. So in some parts of the world, when you rate, you're pressed to say, well, if it's a great experience, why was it? Was it, the behavior of the driver, how they drive? If it was a poor experience, why was that? Sometimes people will let us know, but the more information we get, the more we can improve the offering. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that. It's a very inspirational speech, but I'm also a little frightened. You said in this last response, and you know everything that's going on. You got facial recognition now. Why should public policy officials put so much trust in one company to collect so much data and basically privatize what has been seen as a public good? And then the second question, you mentioned that you actually want regulation. And what's the role of government in ensuring competition? So that ride sharing is actually Uber competing with 5 or 6 other companies and not monopolizing any particular urban area.
Right. Well, first of all, taxis traditionally are not providing a lot of data. So let me say this. One is we understand what you're doing is intimate, where you're going, how often you go. So our core number one objective is to keep that sacred, so that your trip information. So we don't monetize your rides. We could. Everyone would like to know more about that. We simply use it to improve the product. So we have a better sense of supply and demand, of peaks, of traffic issues. We share some of that data with cities, and we're eager to find ways to do more because we think we know a lot about how people are moving around. But again, you've got to think about Uber is, first of all, in competition. We view our competition as not just taxis or other ride sharing. It's everything. It's personal car use. It's taxis. We think we complement public transportation, but it's all the ways that people move around. That's our competition. But to the extent you're focused on ride sharing in most parts of the world, you've seen we've got strong competition in Southeast Asia, in North America, in many parts of the world. And I think in Japan, you haven't seen that ecosystem emerge. But once Japan finally embraces core ride sharing, you'll see a lot of competition here. And, our view is that's healthy. We just merged with our Chinese competitor. And that competition in China made us a better company everywhere in the world. But it's also great for drivers. So in most parts of the world, again, if you get in a ride-sharing trip, those drivers are more likely than not to have multiple apps on at the same time. And that's the way the system works. If they have, and our view is we'd love as many trips to be Uber as possible. But if a driver goes out for 3 hours and they have 6 Uber trips and 3 trips from our competitor, that person's going to be happier with the experience, satisfied with the income. So I think that, and there's an enormous amount of innovation in this space. And it's not just, we see offshoots of what we do all over the world where people may be doing longer transportation, people doing set routes, right? In New York City, there's a company that just does set routes up and down certain streets. So you're starting to see a lot of innovation in that space. But again, I don't think, we have become a large company. We have a lot of people riding on the platform and driving on the platform. It's a smidgen of the taxi trips in most cities, and it's clearly a smidgen of how people get around. We just become a very important, as it turns out, there was a missing link. And the transportation regulations around the world had 2 perverse effects. One is we were limiting the number of people that could make money doing something pretty much all of us can do, drive, because most cities and countries have caps on number of drivers. And 2 is we forced most of us into car ownership. Because unless we live right next to a public transportation line or can walk to work, we were forced into car ownership. And so what we're seeing around the world is many families now, families with kids deciding to go from 2 cars to 1 because it's now possible to do that. So, but we think there's a lot we can do with governments around, we're starting, and we're eager to do this in Tokyo, we're starting to get more involved with a lot of governments around the world around big events. How can we play a role? Again, not an exclusive role, but a complementary role in terms of the way people move around events like the Olympics. In the U.S., we just had our big political conventions, and we played a critical role in providing, again, lots of people still were taking taxis or public transportation, but we become a very important complement to that. Yeah. Yes?
Mr. Plouffe, thank you very much. I have a question. So Uber is obviously a business, and in light of the upcoming elections, one issue is access to polling stations. Has there been any talk or spitballing about providing some sort of like civic duty or civic service so that people who have trouble reaching polling stations can, take an Uber or something like that?
Right.
Just kind of curious.
Well, our view is the best thing we can do to improve turnout and electoral participation is just to be messaging our riders and drivers, reminding them that early vote is closing this weekend, or reminding them it's election day. We'll have some more news to announce on that in the next 24 hours to make it easier for people to find polling places. Now, in America, providing rides would be a violation of election law. But we do have a service now. For the first time, we're allowing people to book pre-scheduled rides. So there's some organizations, I think, looking at utilizing that technology to get some of their clients to the polls. But the biggest thing we can do is, we've got a lot of immigrants on our platform, we've got a lot of younger people on the platform, and to try and encourage them to participate. Facebook's been doing a lot of this. I think, I used to be in politics, so I do think one of the best things you can do is just be in front of people and reminding them, and if they need to know where their polling location is, to make it easy. With young people today, if it takes them more than 10 seconds to find something out, you've probably lost them. Those of you in the consumer space understand this. Speed reigns. And so I think we're trying to do as much of that as possible. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I have a question about how long do you think the window will remain open where you can talk both about increasing the opportunities for people to be drivers and about the future being driverless cars?
Right. Well, first of all, I'd say this is going to be something because a lot of the, whether it's machine learning, artificial intelligence, even augmented reality, which will have a big effect on some of the hardware manufacturers here in Japan and the US, I mean, these are going to be pretty amazing challenges for government and business alike. So it's not just, I think so much of the debate has been around the disruption that's going to happen to people in traditional blue-collar industries. The white-collar disruption in accounting and legal, even some people believe in engineering, is going to be massive. I mean, I even think in politics, some of the decisions I used to make, I shouldn't make them anymore. Watson should make them, okay? Most of them, by the way. And so I think this is going to be a challenge. Our view is, listen, no one knows for sure because there's technology, there's consumer adoption, there's infrastructure, there's regulatory. And right now, the technology is not perfect. Small things like a paper bag blowing in front of an autonomous car can still confuse the car. And so we've got a ways to go. So we think it's going to be more gradual. Our view is 10 years from now, we'll still be heavily recruiting drivers to be part of the platform. Part of this is the overall demand. So like in trucking, in many countries, including the US, there's a massive shortage of people to do long-haul trucking. So trucking is an obvious place where you're going to begin to see more automation. But you'll still need a driver for the beginning and end of the trip. Many people own their own trucks, and so now they can put those in service 24 hours a day. And there's just a shortage. I think for the foreseeable future, you're going to see these two things stand side by side. There's still going to be a lot of work involved with autonomy in terms of servicing these vehicles, on the marketing side, many that none of us can envision yet. There's going to be significant work there. But, this is the challenge for all governments and policymakers, is to be making decisions, understanding. So from a mobility standpoint, again, it's crazy for those of us at Uber who've been there for a while to talk about this, right? So the debate here is just like, hey, people like to use Uber home from bars, and the taxi company doesn't want it. I get that that's like 1.0. Big things are happening. And what we wanted to do today is kind of elevate this debate a little bit so you understand what's at stake when cities fall too far behind. But I think we all have to understand that there's going to be big changes. They won't probably be as immediate as people think, but what does that mean in terms of our education system and our training system? We don't see the future of work changing, meaning most of the people who drive on Uber have traditional work. But will 20 years from now, will people more want to be doing freelance work, is how they piece together the entire economic situation? So one of the things I think that's a challenge for government is you're just dealing with what's right in front of you. But we need to be making more and more decisions, understanding, and also the speed. So think about, like, Uber didn't exist 6.5 years ago. We are providing autonomous rides on a ride-sharing platform in a major global city. And we have trucks riding on interstates with no one in them. And carpooling is now taking off all around the world. So that's just in 6 years. The next 6 years will contain even more change than that. And so I think that we want to be part of that discussion, and obviously a big part of it. But again, given the demand on the platform, given the fact that it seems like it's more imminent than it is everywhere, we're going to have a huge need for drivers for quite a while. But that's going to be a question for all of us, which is, how is our economy changing? We've been able to manage our way through every big disruption economically previously. This will be another one. But what's fascinating to me is I think a lot of the disruption in the next 10 years will be more traditional white-collar industries in terms of machine learning and artificial intelligence. hopefully there'll still be a role for art and judgment. But yeah.
I'm Christopher Jones from the Journal. My question is about Uber Eats. And as you pointed out, because we don't have ride sharing in Tokyo, that makes this market a bit different for you compared to the other cities in the world where you've launched. How are you addressing this? What is your strategy for making Uber Eats a success here without that ride sharing component?
Well, it's interesting. I think here in Tokyo, more people will come to know the Uber brand through food delivery than through taking rides. So that's a first. You know, we have Uber Eats in most of our global cities, and it's going extraordinarily well. But in that case, you already have an existing driver population. And this is just, now, the drivers don't have to drive for Uber Eats, but many of them choose to do it because it's another way to make income. So in this case, we're recruiting fresh drivers just for delivery of food. And what's exciting is, I believe 60% of the restaurants that we partner with here in Japan did not have existing delivery options. So it opens up whole new markets for them. So, you know, what's interesting is eventually we're very optimistic that eventually full-scale ride sharing will be embraced here in Japan. And, you know, people will already be used to pressing a button and getting food. Now they'll add a ride to it. So that will be the inverse of the rest of the world, where people are like, oh, I press a button and get a ride, so I'll try this food option. But again, it's a great way to build up brand awareness, I think awareness of the power of the technology. It's a great economic opportunity for the people who drive and for the restaurants that now have a whole new market that's been created. So it is a little unusual in that this is becoming the foundation as opposed to something that comes in after the ride sharing's been established. I would encourage you all to try it. It's really exciting.
Hi, David. Yeah, great and really compelling presentation. So I've got a lot of questions. So just one then would be around the regulatory aspect. So we know obviously taxis have to have a certain kind of car and maintain it a certain way by a certain company. So this obviously raises the price and the cost of running that. So Uber's been very successful in other countries at improving regulation so that you can kind of capitalize on that gap. I've been in Singapore where other ride-sharing companies are quite successful, and the traditional taxi drivers have seen slumps of something like 30%. I was in Sydney earlier this year, and similar kind of numbers. So when you look at Japan, which is heavily regulated, and it's a very different ballgame in terms of getting around that, how does that play out, and what does it really mean for the existing industry? Is it just a case that, well, taxis are a sort of a thing of the past, or
Right.
Is there another way to maintain the health of those industries?
Yeah, we definitely don't think taxis are a thing of the past. I mean, we are prohibited in all the laws that get passed from engaging in street hail activity. For instance, to use one example, we generally don't have preferential treatment at airports and things. So no, I think what you see is sometimes there's a dip, but then over time, because again, people are changing the way they're getting around. So anybody that's in the business of moving people around, taxis, public transportation companies like ours, has an opportunity at those passengers. So you think about people who may be taking Uber in from the suburbs into a city. Once those people are in a city and in a place that has more ability for taxis to get that business, make business decisions to make sure that you're making those drivers more efficient. So a lot of this has to come with innovation. Many cities have taken the opportunity, though, to do additional deregulation of the taxi industry. So the most important, and we're all in favor of that. It'd be hypocritical for us not to be. So some cities have given taxis more price flexibility, for instance, lowered barriers to entry to drivers. All these are very important. And so, again, we do not think, this is not a choice between ride sharing and taxi. There will be some competition for the traditional taxi industry. We believe over time that smooths out. And ultimately, if they innovate and understand where they can maximize this change of behavior, they'll be okay. But it's important to understand that there have now been all over the world new regulations passed. So the debate 4 or 5 years ago was 50-year-old regulations, new technology. That's never a satisfying debate. So what you've seen countries around the world do is, okay, we're going to create new ride-sharing regulations that understands that someone who wants to drive their Prius for 4 hours a week for 4 months, that should be enabled. I think some of them, not as many of them as I would like, have also looked at the taxi regulations and say, how can we give them some relief, and understanding that technology can also affect that industry, but particularly on price flexibility, we found that to be enormously important. So again, this is not a decision between, I mean, if you go to New York City or London, we've got massive businesses, so do our competitors, and the taxi industry is still quite healthy. And again, I think that's only going to accelerate as younger people who move to these cities will buy cars and use cars much less frequently than the generation before. And so we really see us as, again, an important complement to those things. But even in New York City and London, where we are very large, the number of taxi trips dwarfs what we do. And so that's our view of it, but we think smart regulation enables ride sharing in a smart, modern way, but also looks at, how could we deregulate the taxi and limo industry to make them a little more competitive? Yeah.
David, thanks for the presentation and sharing with us how much more Uber is than we even realized, and the exciting things you guys are doing. 2 questions. First is, why did you join Uber? And the second one, since you mentioned before you'd take political questions, we're running out of time. If you could just give us a couple minutes on how you see the current situation.
We might need a couple hours for that. Yeah. So I joined Uber personally. I was, I had been working with Barack Obama in different iterations for over a decade, and had spent my career in politics, which in the U.S. you can do. There's professional people who are involved. Our campaigns are too expensive, too lengthy. And I had done both stints in government and in politics, and also in the private sector. But I was coming to the end of my journey in politics. And I believe it's hard to be a mercenary in politics, and so I would never believe in anybody like I believed in him again, so I wouldn't do as good a job. So I was looking for a new challenge, and at my advanced age, learning new things and being surrounded by brilliant young people as we are, learning about the world's cities in a much more nuanced way than the geopolitical way I knew. You learn a lot about cities' economic, transportation, social issues. So I was challenged to learn new things, but I was also motivated by the mission. First of all, to give, the reason I'm a Democrat is I believe we need to make more economic decisions based on helping people in poverty get into the middle class and stay there. And I saw something, while it wasn't a government program, it had on scale. And we have 600,000 drivers in the U.S. That's a lot, okay? Who are making additional money. And I saw the inequality of transportation. So I used to live in Chicago, where President Obama's from. The south side of Chicago is an absolute transportation desert. No cabs, hardly any public transportation, impossible to get around. And Chicago was being transformed because people could press a button and get anywhere they wanted in 3 minutes, just like the wealthiest people in the city. So that's what motivated me. And the challenge of, I thought this was a good thing. And even though it wasn't a government program, so many progressives in the U.S. tend to look at things as government and non-government, I thought that it was something that could stand alongside things like public transportation that were government to do good. So I was motivated by the mission, but also by the ability to learn new things and be challenged and make mistakes, and I've done all those things. Our political, first of all, the good news is it's over in 6 days. No, I've worked in politics for a long, long time, and I've never seen an election that has people around the world, but in our country, this ready for it to be over. It's been a fairly dispiriting affair. This is not a partisan assessment. So Hillary Clinton is almost certainly going to win just because she's got a significant lead in enough, we have this very Byzantine system where we have 50 states, and each of the states basically has a score based on their population, electoral votes, and you've got to win enough of them. She's got a decisive edge. She's not going to win by the 8 or 10 points that people thought she might win 2 weeks ago. That it's naturally tightened. My guess is she'll win in the sort of 3 to 6 point range. There's polls that have, I think there was one today that had Trump winning that has the entire world upset or excited, depending on your point of view. But political polling is about the most broken thing in the world, in need of serious disruption. But based on, if you look at all the aggregate data and voting behavior, and when you model out the electorate, which you can do in a pretty sophisticated way in America now, as sophisticated as the best consumer companies, you have a very eerie sense of how people are going to vote. We have a big early voting phenomenon in the U.S., so many people have already voted. About 20% of our electorate's already voted, and you know who's voted. And a good campaign has a 99.9% read on how they voted. And so all that looks pretty good with Clinton outside of a couple of states. So I think so the big question is, for me, is not what's going to happen, but what comes after. Issues like trade, which is very important, given the TPP here in Japan, have become more complicated. We are only a two-party system for now, and there's growing parts of both parties that are getting more economically populist. And we've got some big tax reform, entitlement reform, immigration reform, criminal justice reform, which is not a big issue here, but a massive issue in America. We're incarcerating too many people. How do we limit that and give those people economic opportunity? All those are areas for possible progress. But the other thing that worries me is about 25% of the American people, if Hillary Clinton wins, will not believe she's a legitimately elected president, because we've never had a candidate for president threaten not to recognize the results of an election. And our democracy is built on that cornerstone of a peaceful transition of power. And so hopefully he'll do the right thing. But you know, Trump's done well, Bernie Sanders did well, who ran against Hillary Clinton, in part because of this economic anxiety. And we certainly see it manifested on our platform. All these people showing up to drive and make some money simply because they're not worried anymore about losing their job. You know, that's where we were during the recession. They're just not satisfied with the income. And, you know, people in the Republican Party wanted a bomb thrower. Somebody who had no political experience, somebody from the outside, someone who they thought was strong, who never apologizes. And he was out of central casting for this moment. But I think that the one unifying thought in America right now is just let it be over. But, you know, if I'm wrong, if the race is closer than I think it is in a lot of prognostic, you know, because most of the sites that try and model out the election in the news media give her 90% chance she's going to win. If it's much closer than that, it's simply because turnout amongst young people, in America we call it the Obama coalition, younger women, African-American voters, young people, it really is not what she needs it to be. And if that falls off the cliff, she probably still wins, but it's going to be very, very close. And that's the greatest challenge she has, is there's not as much enthusiasm for her as they probably would like. And, you know, Trump does have enthusiastic supporters, so his challenge is how to have that organized well enough to materialize into really exaggerated turnout. So it's going to be fascinating. The other thing I'd say is, you know, our campaigns are too long, they're too expensive. I mean, this thing, like, it's been going on for 100 years. But there's only a few big moments, and the last big moment was our last debate, which is still an important moment in American politics. So you basically have 3 weeks where you don't have any big moments. And so the last few days, I think, you know, Clinton's had more of a rough of the ride in the press. So you're just kind of, you know, it's challenging, because you don't have any big moments to galvanize attention. And the way our press works is they were tired of the Clinton's going to win in a landslide. And so, you know, these things tend to go back and forth. And I'm not saying it's designed this way, but it certainly is much more interesting in the news media every day if it's covered as a very close race. So 4 years ago, we won a pretty decisive election. And all the coverage heading into the last week of the Romney-Obama race was closest race of our lifetime, dead heat, you know, America blocked. And, you know, we won by 4 points and won 332 electoral votes. So I think the way this is covered is there's a hyper ventilation around how close it is, I think, to drive interest. And, you know, there's a gazillion polls every day, and you can find one that satisfies your view of the race. But for the last 6 months, the race hasn't really changed. Hillary Clinton has had a small but significant lead. That really hasn't changed. It's ebbed and flowed a little bit. And so we are where we were. That being said, a different Republican candidate could have easily won this election. And so that's what's fascinating, is that the nominee, the biggest event of this campaign was who was nominated. And Trump brings a lot of strengths to the table. He's getting certain voters very excited. But a different nominee, a more centrist Republican nominee, probably would have won the White House. So that generally doesn't happen where there's that much of a departure from, like, what could be a considerable loss to a win. That doesn't happen very often. And so, in our system, which is a two-party system, it's not a parliamentary system, the selection of a president is an incredibly personal decision for the American people, and they take it very seriously. So party is very, very important, but for the middle of the electorate, it's less important than the person. And I think in that case, but we've also never, the last thing I'll say is we've never had a president enter office with unfavorable numbers this high. So either of them who wins is going to have unfavorable ratings of close to 60%. And so that's going to be a challenge for our next president as they enter with not a lot of, and hopefully, I think she'll win, and I think she'll do an incredible job and strengthen an office. But this is a very strange political season. I know it looks weird over here. It looks even weirder close up. And I really can't believe we're living through it. I mean, I've never seen, if you had written a screenplay for a movie and said, this is what happened, no one would have signed. They would have said, this is crazy. It's not, it's like, this makes House of Cards seem like the most believable thing in the political system. So that is my last observation on it, is I don't think we'll see another one like this. I will say this, though, the politics all around the world is interesting. So the French elections, the German elections, we see nationalism and isolationism on the rise everywhere. So this is not a United States phenomenon. I think we're going to have some really important elections over the next couple of years. And some of the same things we're seeing in the U.S., actually we were harbingers elsewhere in the last couple of years. Thanks, everyone.
So, David, thank you very much for your great speech and fascinating, and also thank you very much for sharing your view on the campaign on the president. As a co-chair of Transportation and the Logistics Committee, we really appreciate your presence here and giving us a great speech. Particularly in Tokyo, as you may know, that inbound tourism that you touched on a little bit on the Uber story, we hit 20 million inbound mark just last week. And it was a target for the government by 2020. So government now changed the targets to 40 million. So there's a lot of role for Uber to play in this market. And we really appreciate your bigger presence in Japan in the next couple of years. Thank you so much. And here's a token for Uber appreciation. And this is a certificate of appreciation. And this is a little gift with the ACCJ logo. Thank you very much.